Matt Steele, President and CEO of the Danville Regional Foundation. On behalf of the DRF Board of Directors and our staff, I welcome each of you here today. And we're honored that you've chosen to spend your time with us tonight for fellowship and shared learning. Our last speaker series was in April of 2019. The speaker then was Harvard Professor Robert Putnam. The world's changed a lot since April 2019. In our region, most of this change has been very, very positive. We're seeing lots of growth. We see new people, new companies, and projects that are revitalizing important sites throughout our region. We see a renewed energy and enthusiasm and really great examples of collaboration. More and more people are stepping up and they're embracing their role as leaders and creating change in our communities. We want to celebrate this success tonight and learn how we can keep this progress moving forward and to think strategically about the important work that lies ahead of us. Which brings me to the introduction of our speaker. And Rich is the ideal person to do this. Rich Harwood, President and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation, has devoted his career to revitalizing the nation's hardest hit communities, transforming the world's largest organizations, and reconnecting institutions like newsrooms and schools to society. Over the past 30 years, Rich has developed a philosophy and practice of how communities can tackle shared problems, create a culture of shared responsibility, and deepen our civic faith. His experience working on the ground to build capacity and coalitions for change give him a unique and powerful insight on bridging divides and creating resilient communities. I'll give one example of this. In Newtown, Connecticut, after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, Rich led the process for the community to collectively decide what they were going to do with that school building. An inspiring and sought-after speaker, Rich regularly keynotes major conferences and events. He has written 6 books, including the Amazon bestseller Stepping Forward and the newly released Unleashed, a proven way communities can spread change and make hope real for all. Today, Rich is spreading a vision for what it takes to create an America that reflects the best in us and of us. In his groundbreaking new report, Civic Virus, Why Polarization Is a Misdiagnosis, Rich explains what's really going on in America and how we can get on a more practical, hopeful path forward. His message is one of hope and optimism, and we're thrilled that he's here with us today to inspire us, help us discover our many assets, and provide tools and techniques for including everyone in designing the future of this region. With that, please welcome Rich Harwood.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? That's too bad. It's great to be here, Clark. Thanks so much. You know, I get to travel for a living and for a calling, and I encounter a lot of funders across the country. And I really just want to emphasize, not every community is blessed with a foundation like the Danville Regional Foundation. How about a round of applause for all the great work that they do? We're coming, as Clark said, we're coming out of a period where we were sort of all isolated, right? Coming out of COVID. We're coming out of a period where we've been struggling and wrestling with systemic racism and social injustice. We're coming out of a period where there has been economic turmoil in our country. We're coming out of a period, we're still in a period of political turmoil in our country, right? As I travel the country, I don't know if this is true here, but I was just in Alamance County, North Carolina, right yesterday, talking to folks, and people are fatigued. I don't know about you, are you tired?
Yeah.
It's tiring doing this work. It's an uphill struggle. It's tiring. It feels like we're pushing a rock up a hill, and just when we make progress, we lose ground again. There have been so many losses over the last 3 years. I won't recount them all, but you know what they are. And it seems as though we need a reset as a country and in our communities if we're going to move forward. And so before I say anything else, I just want to thank you and honor all the great work that I know each and every one of you is doing. So a round of applause for yourselves. Now, I know, as Clark just said, there are good things happening in this area, right? Good things happening in this area. You've got businesses moving downtown, mills being redone. You've got a new casino coming to town with 80% approval. You've made investments in early childhood education, workforce development. This institute exists. There are a lot of things. This community is on the cusp of what someone said today is exponential growth, right? Exponential growth. But I don't want to sugarcoat anything today. You've got challenges as well. I hope you didn't think I was just going to come here and celebrate. I want to be real tonight. You've got challenges as well. Your wages are the lowest in the Commonwealth of Virginia, beneath the U.S. average. Your health outcomes are at the low end of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Your education outcomes are at the bottom of the Commonwealth of Virginia. You have people in this region, here in Pittsylvania County, in Danville, in Coswell, who believe that they are not seen and heard, that they're not valued as much as other people. You've got folks in this region who believe that growth is going to leave them behind, that they will be left out and left behind. The question for a region like this is, how does a region like this grow and take advantage of its potential growth and ensure that everyone comes along? That community is genuinely a common enterprise, not just for some of us, but for all of us. That there is genuinely a culture of shared responsibility in this community, and that every single individual can participate in America's promise and fulfill their God-given potential. You with me? Yes. All right. Now, there are folks in this country who say it is not possible for communities like this to deal with these challenges and make its way forward. You've heard this argument. We are too polarized as a nation, right? We are too polarized as a nation. Well, I spent a year walking across the country, talking to Americans in all types of communities. The most rural western county in Kansas, to Eugene, Oregon, to the most conservative towns in America, Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Sarasota, Florida, to Houston, New Orleans, and every place in between. And if I gave you the transcripts of these conversations, and I took off the names of the communities and any specific references to their communities, you could not tell which community I was actually talking about. That we share that much in common in this country. And here's what people told me about the United States of America today. They said, we're not polarized. There's actually something more dangerous happening, yet something more actionable. They said 3 things. Actually, they said a lot more, but how much time you got? I want to highlight 3 things they said. 1, we are separating and segregating as a society at a faster rate than ever before. Now, we have always been a segregated country in many respects. We were founded on it. But we are separating and segregating ourselves more and more into smaller and smaller groups, and it's happening increasingly in rural areas as well. We are increasingly separating and segregating ourselves because we are anxious. We are isolated from one another. There's a mental health crisis in our society. And if you think that COVID is the cause of this, it surely accelerated and exacerbated our problem. But the anxiety that exists in America existed long before COVID ever came around and we ever heard the word articulated, right? And here's the thing about this separation and segregation. You can tell me if this happens here, if this happens with you. Because we are so fearful of one another, we make snap judgments about each other. That's right. I make a snap judgment based on the t-shirt you're wearing and the slogan it's got. I make a snap judgment based on the baseball hat you wear and what it says. I make a snap judgment when I'm following you in my car and you pull into a parking lot and there's a bumper sticker on the back of your car. And I think I know everything about you. What you believe, what you think, what you feel, what you value, who you pray to. And here's the thing. What do we know about each other based on those things? Not a damn thing. Nothing. And yet, increasingly, we are making these judgments. Second, are there any politicians in this room, elected officials? Well, even if there were, I'd still say this. So they need to hear it. Our politicians, the news media, with the aid of social media, are intentionally manufacturing and stoking polarization and division in this country. Why? Because they want to win votes. Why? Because they want more viewers. Why? Because social media needs you more attached so they can make more money. But here's the thing. Who gave them the mandate to divide us and be so corrosive in this country? Who gave them the mandate to pull us down and tear us apart when we need to build each other up and support one another? And what Americans tell me is that this noise, it's kind of a surround noise that's creating confusion and disorientation. You know, we can't tell what's true and what's not true anymore. We can't tell what's a fact and what's fiction. We can't tell who's telling us the truth and who's not, right?
Amen, brother.
How in God's name can we move forward as a community if these are the conditions we live under? Third point. We are having a natural human response to these conditions. Don't listen to the polarization stuff. There's something else going on. We are engaged in fight or flight. It's not a phrase I made up. It's not a phrase I looked up. It's not a phrase I got out of college. It's what Americans told me in one conversation after another. We're in fight or flight. So many of us are so fed up and so fearful of talking to one another and saying the wrong thing, are so fearful of articulating what we believe that we fled altogether and retreated from public life, right? And then there are those of us who have decided we're going to come out swinging. We're going to fight. We're going to win no matter what. In fact, we're going to win at any cost. More and more groups across the country are weaponizing their agendas and pushing us into corners and making us deal with false choices that never existed and still don't exist. But here we are. We get into social media and we all of a sudden find groups that we can belong to, and before you know it, we're gone down the rabbit hole because they've created algorithms that take us deeper and deeper into this mystical place. And before you know it, people join groups, sometimes hate groups, sometimes political groups, sometimes extremists. Not because they agree with everything they're saying. There's something else going on that we need to understand that's really important for this region. They join these groups primarily because they want what we want, what we all want, a sense of belonging, a sense that we matter, a sense that we are seen and heard, a sense that we're in something together with someone else. And what people say is, if I can't join my larger community to get that, I will find a smaller community. And I will join that and I will separate myself from the rest of society. We don't have a political polarization problem in this country. We do in Washington, D.C., where I live. We'd be good to seal that place up. And sometimes in Richmond. We don't have a political polarization problem. We have a human dilemma, a social dilemma, a psychological dilemma that we need to deal with. The question for those of us in this room is whether or not, as the loudest voices, the most divisive voices, the most acrimonious voices take over our public square, will we come back into community with one another to make our community, this region, what we believe it needs to be and should be and can be. That to me is the fundamental. There is no one coming. It's us. It's those of us in this room. It's us. Now when I say this, people often come up to me at some point and say, Rich, because you're working in all these hard places like Jackson, Mississippi and other places, you must have lost hope. You must not have much hope anymore. Clark said, I have a hopeful and optimistic message. They said, well, I don't know how you do that anymore. But here's the thing. I have an abundance of hope. I have more hope today than when I started this work 35 or 40 years ago. And here's why. It's not because I've written books about hope. It's not because I've read it in someone else's book. It's because what I've witnessed. What I've witnessed we Americans can do. In Reading, Pennsylvania, where we're doing work with folks there, 10 years ago, Reading was declared the poorest community in America. 10 years ago, it was predominantly white. Today, it's over 65% Latino. And if you think it's more homogeneous today than it was 10 years ago, it's actually much more diverse. Folks come from 5, 6, or 7 different countries. They have different dialects, different customs, different traditions. It's much more diverse. They asked us to work with them on education. It was at the very same time, I don't know if you saw this throughout the Commonwealth and the rest of the country, that there were debates about whether or not kids should wear masks in schools anymore, about banning books in schools, about getting rid of CRT and DEI. You with me here? That school board members were recalled in lots of communities. That in Sarasota, the night before I gave a speech, the school superintendent was summarily fired without cause. People said that we Americans are too divided, too polarized to come together and figure out how we want our communities to come together. Well, in Reading, Pennsylvania, they came together and created a shared agenda from the community about education and educational equity in their community. It has 9 items. It focuses on things like early childhood education, English as a second language, and mental health, and a whole bunch of other issues. And here's the thing. People said no one would come together to work on it. Well, when we held our first Public Innovators Lab, 50 people showed up. 3 teams formed to work on 3 different sets of issues. Those teams started with 8 people. They're now each 40 to 50 people. People are coming out of the woodwork to work together. It just goes to show that if we engage people in a certain kind of way, if we make space for a different kind of conversation, if we talk about what we're for and not simply what we're against, that we can overcome the barriers that people say are holding us back and holding us down. We don't have to succumb to the national debates where people are telling us what to do. We can drive our own change and our own progress right here in this community. Here's another example. Clark County, Kentucky, where we were doing work. Clark County is about the size, a little smaller than this county. It's a county divided by race, by geography. It's a rural county, by faith. It's got an opioid and meth problem. Kids who go to a blue ribbon high school told us they feel abandoned because there aren't enough adults in their lives. This is happening all over our country. 2 women were sitting in church one day, and they heard about a conference in Louisville dealing with drug abuse. These 2 women were in recovery themselves. They decided to go to this conference. They decided because every time someone overdosed in Clark County, in Winchester, and they went to the emergency room, what do you think happened? They were detoxed and then thrown back on the street. Thrown back on the street, they relapsed, and they were right back in. No problem was being solved. So these women went to this conference, and they learned about how they could create a new model to deal with this issue. It's happening across the country now. They decided to recruit other people in recovery, and they trained them. And so when someone went to the emergency room with an overdose, one of these coaches met them at the emergency room. And when they met them at the emergency room, they ensured that they weren't simply judged, but there was an empathetic response. When they left the emergency room, the coach left with them and made sure they got home. When they woke up the next day, the coach made sure they got attached to a social network, because we know social networks are more important than medical care to get over addiction. They didn't stop there. They got them attached to financial literacy skills and job training and helped them find a job. And this worked so well that all the clinicians, the physicians, and the nurses in the medical system that didn't want to give them the time of day before, all of a sudden rung them up on the phone and said, hey, would you come train us? We need to learn what you're doing. We have so much innate capabilities in our communities, like these 2 women that we're not tapping, that we don't see. And it just goes to show that when we can step forward and engage on these issues, we can solve them. We can make a difference. Last example. You still with me?
Yes.
Last example. Clark mentioned Newtown, Connecticut, Sandy Hook Elementary School. You remember the massacre there, right? 21st graders were gunned down and 6 adults. Happened in December of 2012. 4 weeks after the massacre, I got a phone call from the mayor of Newtown asking me whether or not I would come up and design and lead a process by which the community could figure out how to move forward. I told her that I wasn't sure. I told her that I needed to think about it. I told my colleagues in my office I didn't know whether or not this was the right thing for me to do, whether or not I had enough experience. So I had a lot of self-doubt. And when I thought about it some more, I realized that I had a responsibility to step forward, that I was being asked to do something because I'd worked in so many communities that had experienced trauma, and that I, as a child, grew up with a lot of trauma in my life, and that I had a responsibility to step forward. And so I went there. And when I started to work with the community, I realized real quick that this wasn't about a school building. This was about whether or not a community, after an inexplicable, unexplainable massacre, could move from trauma and despair to some semblance of healing and hope. The mayor created a task force of 28 elected officials from 4 different governing boards. As you can imagine, they didn't like each other. People told us this was a recipe for political disaster. The community was up in arms. Most people didn't believe we should be having this conversation so soon after the massacre. They believed we should wait a year or two. But we went ahead anyway. Every meeting we held was in the city council chamber in public. There were scores of television cameras at every single meeting we held, from CNN and CBS, reporters from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. They all came every meeting. And as we were moving through this process, I was about to go from Washington, D.C., where I live, back up to Newtown for a meeting where we thought we were going to make a final decision about how to move forward. Except I got another phone call that morning from the mayor's office, and they said, check out the article in the Wall Street Journal. And there was a huge article that said 30 teachers from Sandy Hook Elementary School had released a public letter saying that under no conditions would they go back to that school. That under no conditions. So I still had to go up. I flew up. There were not only these scores of television cameras and journalists, but hundreds and hundreds of Newtown residents who were there to hear what this task force would decide. The room was packed. And so I walked into the middle of the room when we were about to start, and I said, you know, we thought we were going to make a decision tonight, but we have to wait. And for the one and only time we ever did this, we cleared the room of everyone, including the journalists and all the residents. And we invited the 30 teachers into the room. And the 30 teachers sat behind one table, clustered together, almost like they were protecting themselves. It was them, the task force, 2 mental health professionals, and myself. And for the next 2 or 3 hours, they told the most harrowing stories I have ever heard. About hearing the gunshots ring through the halls. About hiding their students underneath chairs. About pushing their kids into storage closets. About barricading their doors to make sure the gunman Adam Lanza couldn't get into their classroom. About seeing some of their colleagues gunned down and writhing in pain, but they couldn't help them. And so after we allowed them to talk as long as they wanted, we invited everyone back into the room. And that night I had to stand there in the middle of that room and say, tonight's not the night to make a decision. The task force was emotionally beside themselves. And so I sent them home and said, we'll come back in 2 weeks. And when we came back in 2 weeks, well, actually the day before, the day I got home from Newtown, right after that meeting, of course, I got a phone call from some journalists. And they've been asking me questions all along, and they said, you see, we told you it couldn't work. We told you they'd never make a decision about what to do with this school building. We don't even know why you tried. Now what's your comment? So we went back up 2 weeks later and reconvened the task force. And the task force was split on what to do. Was split. We met way into the night. We started like at 7 o'clock. It was now, I was looking at a clock, it was now midnight or 1 a.m. We still weren't any closer to a decision. And then as we were split, one member of the task force leaned forward and said, you know, at some point we're going to have to figure out a way forward. At some point we're going to have to make a choice. At some point we're going to have to make a decision. And so he said, I'm going to join the other group. And as he did that, other people started to join the other group. And eventually we reached a decision. It wasn't 51 to 49, it wasn't 75-25. It was a unanimous decision to tear down the building and start again. It just goes to show that under the worst conditions, the most inexplicable things in our lives, that we have the wherewithal, the wisdom, the know-how, the courage, and yes, the humility to be able to step forward and reach out to one another across our divides and make something happen. That we don't have to try to win at any cost all the time. That we don't have to be the one that's always right. That we don't have to always get our way. That we're not always going to be able to take credit for something that happened. That sometimes we just have to support the community because it's the right thing to do. So here's some things I think this region needs to do. You still with me?
Yes.
You sure?
Yes.
So I want to talk about 5 things I think you ought to focus on. There are lots of things we could talk about, but I just want to focus on 5 that are on my mind. And they're all under the banner of this. How we do the work is as important as what we do. And I was in 2 roundtables today with different folks, some of you here tonight. And I came away thinking this even more than when I came into town last night. How we do the work in this region is going to be as important as what we do. So here's the first thing. We are awash in negativity in this country. We need to begin having conversations not about what we're against, but about what we are for. About what we are for. That's particularly important in this region. You've got folks who are afraid of growth because they're afraid they're going to have to give up something in their life. The only way they're going to move forward is if they can articulate what they're for. You have folks who believe that they aren't seen or heard. The question is, are we going to engage them about what they're for and the types of lives they're trying to create? Here's the thing. We spend more time talking about what we're against than we do what we're for. We spend more time talking about our differences than what we hold in common. I don't know about you, I'm tired of it. But here's the thing. We tend to do one of 2 things when we engage people in communities. Tell me if this ever happens here. We ask people, what problems do you have and what do you want me to do to fix them? I just heard this conversation. What happens when we ask people about their problems? They give us a long laundry list. When they give us a long laundry list, they want to know who's going to solve them. When they haven't been solved, they want to know who is responsible. When they find out who's responsible, they want to cast aspersions. When they cast aspersions, they want to push us into corners. Where are we at that point? We're in a toxic cul-de-sac called America's public discourse. When we don't do that, can't imagine anyone doing this here, but we do visioning exercises. You ever do those? With the little yellow dots? You know what I'm talking about? Just tell me what you dream for this community. Don't talk too much. Just take your little yellow dot and put it next to the thing up on the newsprint. We'll add them all up and then we'll know what people want. You ever notice what happens to those reports? Those reports are 4 colors, saddle stitched on glossy paper. What happens? They go in the trash. They end up on a shelf and gather dust. You know why? There are lots of reasons, but there's one reason in particular. Americans aren't utopians. We're not after some utopian vision. We're practical folks. We want to know how my life and our lives can get better tomorrow. So here's an alternative. Someone said to me today, we need to learn how to ask better questions. Right, Lori? We do. So here's the question I think we ought to start with. What are our shared aspirations for our community? When you ask someone about their aspirations, try this tonight or tomorrow. They will tell you something from their gut that is meaningful in their lives, that is typically actionable, doable, and achievable because it matters to them. People talk about their shared aspirations. All of a sudden, they recognize that we need each other. We can't go it alone to make sure every child thrives in this region. No one can do that by themselves. Let's get real. We need each other. There is no single organization, no single leader, no single resident who can achieve these aspirations on their own. And so all of a sudden we are implicated as citizens, as residents, as members of this community, that we can't just take, we have to give. We have to do it together. Now here's the thing. This came up in our roundtables today. A lot of us, we're uncomfortable talking to people who look different than us. Right? Who dress different. Maybe speak a different native language. Live in a different neighborhood. Live on the other side of the river, whichever side of the river you're on. Live in a different part of the county. I don't go to those rural parts. Right? We're going to have to get the courage, summon the courage to engage people that we're not used to engaging. And we got to get ready to hear things that may be hurtful, that we may not like. Because not everyone's lives are going so well. You know that. We got to stand in that space with folks. There's a basic dignity equation I use. If we don't know what matters to people, then we've denied them their sense of reality. When you deny someone their sense of reality, you have essentially undermined their sense of dignity. We have to decide whether or not each and every one of us should be afforded dignity in our community. It's a basic choice. It's also a basic birthright. It's not something you earn. It's something you have because you're here. We're not real good at honoring each other's dignity. Not folks who look different than us. Not folks who pray to a different God than us. Not folks who drive a different car than us. Not folks who live in a different part of town or a different part of the county than us. Not folks who have a different education level than us. We got to do it though. If we want to move this county and this region forward, dignity has to be non-negotiable. Two, talk alone is not going to get us where we need to go. We got to build together. I don't know about you, I'm tired of going to meetings. I'm tired, people are tired of being convened and asked questions ad nauseum, and then nothing happens. Right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
We can't talk our way to the solutions we need. We can engage each other to figure out where we can start, but then I think we got to start building together. We got to start doing things together. We got to get in motion together. When that happens, we start to recognize that we have talents and resources we never could have imagined before. We realize our shared humanity that we hold together. We recognize that we have talents we can tap into that we're not tapping into right now. And here's the other thing. There is a civic joy that emerges from building together. It's chemical in our bodies. It gets released. A sense that we belong to something larger than ourselves. A sense that we are connected to one another. A sense that we matter to one another. A sense that we can do things together. Think about the feeling you get when you do something with someone else. We need to create that feeling in our communities together with one another. With one another. Third, we need to focus on how change happens. How change happens. Now, I know a lot of you have theories of change. I know the Foundation has a theory of change. A lot of organizations do. Some of them, a few of them, are good. Most of them, not so much. They're theories. They're theories about how the world works. But the world doesn't work in theories. The world works in practical ways. And so what I'm interested in is how change actually happens, not how we want change to happen in some theoretical sense. And so at the Institute, we decided to do a study over 30 years of our work in 9 different communities. And we wanted to see what happened in those communities. And lo and behold, most of the change that was created happened long after we left working with the community. So let me just confess that right up front. Right? It happened long after. But here's one of the things we learned, among others. In each of these communities, many of which created systemic change around education and other issues, all of their change started with small actions. Not comprehensive plans, small actions. Things that we could peel off and get done. And we can get in motion on. And if you trace their change like we did over time, you can see that that small action was catalytic. It catalyzed a whole chain reaction of actions and ripple effects. And those ripple effects spread throughout the community. And as they spread, people started to adopt and adapt different ways of doing work together. So the civic culture was changing. I think we have to start to see ourselves more as catalysts for change than just implementers of comprehensive plans. I think we need to give ourselves permission to start small, to grow things larger. I think we have to see that not every change is going to begin and end with us, that maybe part of our role here on earth is to create these ripples where other people are taking action. And those ripples exist long after the things we ever did. We need to start to think about how change unfolds because so many of our efforts in so many communities stall out. And when they stall out, people get frustrated, they get skeptical. It turns into cynicism, they lose hope. And so if you're concerned about hope, then we need to show more proof that we're actually creating change. That includes building buildings, but it's much more than that. It's making sure that every kid can read. It's making sure there are good health outcomes in this region. It's making sure we're dealing with chronic diseases in this region. We got to build people's lives, not just buildings. It's really important in our communities. Fourth, we need more leaders and organizations that are turned outward toward their community. I heard today over and over again, and I hear in every community that we work, and you can tell me if you agree with this, that too many of us, even the good work that we do, we're doing it in silos. Is that true?
True. Yes.
We're too fragmented. We've got our heads down. Too many of us are seeking cover because we're afraid of getting too public in our work right now. But here's the thing. If we don't have enough organizations and leaders who are turned outward, how in God's name can we create change that matters to people in the community? How can we know what actually matters to folks? How can we know how we can actually work together with other folks and who we actually need to work with and who are the right partners and who are the partners we better leave behind because they're going to hold us back and hold us down? How are we going to figure out how it is that we can move things ahead if we've got our heads down and we're inward looking? I think in our communities we need to adopt a new mindset first and foremost about what it means to be turned outward. We have to look in the mirror and say, will we have our community in our line of sight or just our organization? Will we have all the folks in our community in our line of sight or just our metrics? Will we have all the folks in our community in our line of sight or just worry about our fundraising? It's a basic choice. We have to make it. We need to be more turned outward if we want to advance everyone's lives in this community moving forward. Last point I'm going to make. It's about the stories we tell each other about our community. In the 35 years I've been doing this work, the greatest hidden factor about whether or not communities move forward is the story the community tells itself about itself. Every community has one of these narratives. These narratives shape our mindset, our attitudes, our behaviors, and our action. Here's the deal. In most communities in America right now, the narrative is negative. In Clark County, Kentucky, it was, we will never see better days, we need to return to the past. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
We need to return to the past. In Las Vegas, where I was working, here's what they said their narrative was. I'm for me and you're for me. I'm for me and you're for me. In Youngstown, Ohio, the narrative where we were working on education issues was, catch this, our kids don't have the potential to learn, they're all going to end up behind bars. How is it that we're going to support education in a community if that's the narrative about our kids? I heard someone say about Danville here today, why would you ever want to move back to Danville? Right? We need more can-do narratives in our communities. Narratives that suggest to us we can believe in ourselves and in one another. But here's the thing. Is anyone here working public relations or communications? Okay. Sorry for what I'm about to say. This is not, we don't need another campaign. We don't need new slogans about the community. No one believes them. They feel like they're being sold a bill of goods. It's been done day after day after day. That's what our politicians do every day, or a lot of them. We've got to learn to tell stories that emerge out of our community about the good work that people are doing in the community. We have to learn to tell stories about the good, the bad, and the ugly that happened. About that someone tried something and they fell down and they failed, but they got back up and kept moving and changed directions. We need to learn how to tell these stories. We need to learn how to identify these stories. But here's the challenge. In all the communities that I've been working in, these stories are often invisible to us. And they're often invisible to those of us who are actually doing the work. So we actually created a tool called Making the Invisible Visible, so that people could begin to articulate the change they're creating in their communities and start to spread those stories in the community. We can do it. I've seen it done in numerous communities. We can do it. It needs to be done here as well. These narratives hold us back and they hold us down. All this adds up to, I think, is whether or not we believe in hope. Whether or not we believe in hope. In my faith, there is a teaching, it's a teaching in a lot of faiths, that if you save one life, you save the world. If you save one life, you save the world. Now, it's obvious that if you save one life, you haven't saved the world. So why do we have that teaching, and why do we have teachings like it? I think it's because if you save one life, if you work on behalf of one individual, it means that you have stepped forward and you have seen someone else and heard someone else. If you save one life, it means that you are making a contribution to that individual to move forward. If you step forward and save one life, it means that you have made yourself visible, a part of something larger than just yourself. If you save one life, you've declared your intentions, that tomorrow doesn't have to be like today for a lot of people. There are people who will tell you that your small actions aren't worthwhile. They're too small. They don't matter. If you take nothing else from what I said tonight, I hope you take this. Every action counts. Every action you take is worthy. Everything that you do has meaning. And if you save one life, and the person next to you saves one life, and the person next to them saves one life, and we can keep going around each table, we actually can get something done. But it's going to take all of us, not just some of us. So let me conclude with this. I don't think the change that we need, the progress that you want, to make sure that this community is inclusive, is fair and just, is equitable, is hopeful, is easy work. No one should tell you it's easy. It's hard, you know that. And I'm not naive, I've been doing this work for a long time. And I know how difficult this work can be. But I also know that it's possible. I know it because of our history, our stained history in this country. Right? We fought the American Revolution, the 13 colonies came together. They didn't agree on anything other than the fact that they wanted King George out of this place. They got together, folks from different towns and different regions with very big divisions. They didn't have an internet to coordinate them. And they got together and we won the American Revolution. When we faced the scourge of slavery in this country, we finally, too late, but finally abolished slavery in this country by people coming together and working together and making things happen. When we needed women's suffrage because women in this country couldn't vote, we got together and passed women's suffrage in this country. When we needed voting rights and civil rights, we got it done. When we had to fight the scourge of COVID, notwithstanding all the losses we encountered, we have found a way as a country to come through it. And we will find a way to keep moving forward as a people. The choice is ours about whether or not we will step forward and make the difference. The choice is about your community here in Danville and in this county and in Caswell County. And my plea to you tonight is to step forward, is to join hands with one another, to bridge our divides which are real, to figure out what we can agree on while we disagree on a whole bunch of other stuff. And let's get in motion and create some real hope for everyone who lives in this region. Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to enter into a period of Q&A, so we have rotating mics. Anyone has a question for Rich?
So very interested in a point that you made about needing to be able to change the way we tell our stories. And how can you tell stories that honor the truth without dwelling on the negative?
You ever hear the Good Samaritan story? Right? So everyone knows the Good Samaritan story? Yes. Right? So the guy gets knocked down and robbed. A priest comes along, passes the person on the ground. Another person comes along, you would think they would stop. They didn't. Now we could stop the story there and just tell that no one stopped. No one cared. This person's still on the ground and we don't know what happened to them. We do need to tell that story. It's why it's part of the parable. But there's another part of the story, right? The Samaritan comes along, the person we'd least expect to stop. And much like the two women in Clark County, if you noticed, the Good Samaritan not only got the person up, he took him back into town. Not only did he take him back into town, he made sure he got medical treatment. Not only that, he made sure he was on his way, much like the two women did in Clark County. So I would say that so long as we are telling the whole story, we'll be okay. We'll be okay. If we insist on telling only the good parts of the story, we will lose an authenticity and a genuineness that will undermine the credibility of the stories that we're telling, because no one's going to believe them, because they're not believable. They're not believable. Does that help? So keep the Good Samaritan story in your mind. Other questions, thoughts, reactions, disagreements? I like disagreeing is good. Yes, sir.
I have a question being, I own the historical theater in town, went outside from the DC area, by the way, so former neighbor. And I find Danville going through so much really positive changes. It's quite amazing. What I find it interesting is that the people that have been from Danville or lived there their whole lives, and people like myself that come in, we all have different perspectives.
Yeah.
And I sometimes find that Danvillians will, have more of a negative feeling about their town and everything because it's so close to them. They really can't see all the positive things. And I think they need to share the new people to try and almost convince the long-time residents. You got a lot more going for you here than you think. And so I think ways that we can learn how to do that is an important thing that could benefit us all.
Yeah, I agree. Two very quick comments. I totally agree with your point. One is, I think, as you know, we all change our mindset, attitudes, and behaviors over time. So the stories we tell have to be over time, right? We think we have to keep telling a new story. We have to keep bringing the old stories back in and adding to them. So one is we often don't have the staying power for this. We were talking about this, Clark mentioned this in one of our meetings. This work can take 20, 30, 40 years sometimes, right? And changing a narrative doesn't take that long, but it does take years, and I think we have to have staying power to do that. The other thing I just want to mention, because this is true in counties in Ohio, rural counties in Ohio, where we're doing work where there's a community like Danville at the heart of it, Alamance County, other places. Folks who are natives or who have lived in a place a long time and cherish their way of life, and all of a sudden the growth starts to occur. And essentially, too often these debates, and we work with folks in Greenville, and I know some folks here went to Greenville and visited them. Folks start to believe that we start to say to folks who have been here, you're either with us or against us. And they start to feel like we're going to roll over them, right? We're going to roll over them. We're going to win at any cost. And when someone feels that, what do? They either flee, retreat, or they fight. They fight. I think we need to figure out a different kind of conversation to have with folks, because if you're asking people to give something up with no offer of an alternative in return, that's not a good deal. And this is one of the reasons why I said I think we need to start talking about what we're for, because in doing that, in Ohio, for instance, what we're finding is the folks in the rural part of the county are starting to articulate things that sound very similar to the folks in the larger city. But no one knew that. and it's common ground that we can build off of. So I think that's the other part of this.
How do we fight for a real community when it seems like all technology is moving us to a virtual community where people can sit around the table and look at each other and talk for phones that they're holding in their hands?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, my hope is that there will be a backlash. There seems to be a growing backlash against some of the social media because of what it's doing to our society. And so let's see what happens to that. In the meantime, though, this came up in one of our conversations in a different context. I think that social media, the noise we're hearing from many politicians, from the news media, is creating this kind of surround sound. And we need a civic response to it, not a political response. That would be nice if our politicians, but even if our politicians acted, it wouldn't be enough. Because in places like this, based on what people have told me, we need to create more of a mindset that we need to actually create spaces where people can come and have these conversations, that organizations and groups need to make it part of their central mission to do this work, not as an add-on, that we need to learn practices about how to do this. And then to my point about building, we need to learn how to take what we're learning from these conversations and turn it into action that reflects what matters to people. And typically, even if we do good engagement work, we do lousy strategy work. That's one of the inflection points that occurs. People go out and do all these things, it doesn't get embedded in the actual programs and strategies they're developing. So I think that's where we need to start. And in the meantime, we can hope that social media begins to change.
Thank you. I moved to Danville 53 years ago, and even today some people say, you're not from around here. you must be from up north somewhere. Yes, Richmond, 150 miles away. So I came here in '69 and right at the moment of segregation. And it has been a struggle, a tremendous struggle for everyone. Now, as much as I want to move things forward, I understand the conversations that you're talking about. Without those people who said, you're not from around here, you're from up north, they're the harder ones to have a conversation with.
Yeah.
And I don't mind inviting anybody to the table, but when you get that resistance that we don't want to talk about it because we know the way it was, and you mentioned before about they want to be comfortable in that zone. So how do you bring those people in there?
Yeah.
I've been in positions where we have worked together racially. We are now one of the 4 sites of the U.S. Civil Rights Trail in the state. And I think we're making some progress there. But then, how do I bring those other people to the table? Let's talk about that. And I'll just mention, and I don't know if you know this, and it's kind of like the elephant in the room, but we have this group of Confederate patriots called flaggers who meet once a week on Main Street and wave flags.
Right.
But we go out and talk to them and say, come on in, let's talk about it. Well, okay, if you're not putting the flag up, which the city took down, then we're not talking about anything. So my question would be, how do you incorporate those people into this discussion and move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I did hear about the flags and that there are 13 sites now around that fly them on a regular basis as well. In Alamance County, where there are more divides than you can shake a stick at, and in Clark County, which was the same thing, and in Reading, which is the same thing, I think the strategy here, I think this is about how you move things forward, is how do we begin to peel things off that more people than not value? So in this county, in this region, you have educational outcomes that aren't working. how is it that you can start to see, I know there's some work being done on this, but how can you start to move on parts of that where people can agree enough that we can get moving? This is about building civic confidence and belief and trust. It doesn't mean everyone's going to agree, and it doesn't mean everyone's going to come along. But what it does mean is we can't take the biggest thing we want to work on that's the most divisive and try to solve that first, because I can guarantee you it's going to stall. What we can do is figure out where we can get started, where there is enough agreement, and where we can start taking action together and start to build our confidence. What I find in doing this work now for 35 or 40 years is that in Mobile County, Alabama, where the school system was transformed and education was transformed, where everyone was at each other's throats, urban versus rural, black versus white, poor versus wealthy, they created an education agenda using our work that actually got things moving. Now it's one of the best performing school districts in the state. Still not good enough, but a lot better than it was. But we got to start somewhere and build, as opposed to trying to do everything at once. And that's what I've seen work. If you're asking me what works, that's what I've seen work. I wish we could get there faster, but we're dealing with human beings.
You've made some really good comments, and it's got me to thinking a lot. Because through the years, we've had many conversations like this in this room with many different groups. And before COVID, I think we were making progress in the community on changing mindsets. I think that that's changed somewhat. The progress is hampered because of COVID and the isolation. But now we have some fast change coming to our community.
Yeah.
So people are not having time to come to grips with the change, what it might mean. And your talk about affecting lives is important, because many of us have lived here. I've lived here, I wasn't born here or anything, but I've lived here 46 years. So it's like, this is my home. But everything is changing really quickly. And then it's like, okay, well, what is that going to do for us? Those of us that live here, when all these people move in, and we don't have enough places for people that already live here to find decent places to live, what's going to happen when all these other people come in, buy them up, the prices go up? What's going to happen to all the rest of us? So how do we calm all of that and try to turn it into something positive that we can work on to create something that helps to protect people? Because a lot of that can be a major problem.
Absolutely. So fast forward 10 years, which is where Clarksville, Tennessee is. It's one of the fastest growing communities in America. It was named the number one best place in America to live. We're doing work there. We've been doing work there. So think of an adolescent. This is my answer. It's going to be unsatisfactory, so let me just tell you that at the start, okay? Because I don't think there are simple answers to these things. Think of an adolescent who just grew 6 inches. What happens to their clothes? What happens to their pants? They're too short. What happens to their shirt? Too small. Too small. The buttons burst off, right? What happens to the food in your refrigerator?
It all goes away. It all goes away.
It all goes away. So the analogy here is that much like the adolescent's clothes, communities have a civic culture and a civic infrastructure. I'm not talking about just political, I'm talking about civic. Organizations, leaders, networks, norms, a sense of shared purpose, all of these things make up a civic culture of a community. They're all things that can be created. What happened in Clarksville is they didn't create them. So they had people coming in from Nashville, populating, housing prices are sky high. No teacher can afford to live in that county anymore, right? They have a teacher shortage, right? Housing prices are through the roof. Kids don't have any place to go after school. They had a lot of losses during COVID in schools, right? Their healthcare system isn't up to snuff. They have all these issues they need to deal with. And so our response to them was, the very first thing you should be focused on is you need to build your civic infrastructure so that you can figure out how it is you're going to manage this change moving forward. Because absent that, there's no There's no ability to do what we need to do. Now, whether or not you're at that point here, I don't know. I don't know enough about your community. But what I know is fast-growing places like Greenville, which I have been in, they face the same challenge. And that's one of the things I think you're going to have to wrestle with. There is no getting around the need to build leaders who are turned outward, organizations that know how to bring people together, how to create norms that are more productive and interactive, that create a sense of shared purpose moving forward, that create a more can-do narrative. There's no way around those things if you want a healthy community. And we need to start building them.
I just had a comment. First of all, I just want to thank you. I got several sheets on notes. The one thing that I wanted to say, and I do understand her point when she was talking, but with change comes fear. And with fear, people feel threatened. But the tool that we have, and this is my comment, is transparency. When we have clarity and knowledge, when you were talking about that mindset, you'd be surprised at how much or how more unified people are when you can come together with that mindset because of transparency.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you. Any others? Go ahead, last one.
This kind of mirrors what she was saying too. I think Danville is making a lot of great strides and a lot of great progress towards great things. But then you have a certain subset of people who may be a part of that progress. But then you also have a certain subset of people who are not, whether it's marginalized communities or whatever the case may be. And so it kind of feels like these people are moving forward and they're enjoying these things. And these good things are coming, but that's not for me. Or, I don't fit into that, or they're not going to accept me. Or I have pressing issues that are, that I have to be concerned with, whether it's transportation issues or homelessness issues or, access to food and housing. And so it's kind of like, yes, we can be excited about the progress that we're making. I think we should be. But how do we also make sure we are included and bridging that gap for the other communities and populations who may feel like this is not including them as well?
Yeah. So one thing I just want to say really clearly is you all ought to be I would hope that you're super proud about the progress this community is making. Right? Most communities are going backwards right now. This community is going forwards. Right? That can't be said for every American community right now. So that just can't be said enough. What also can't be said enough is that when communities grow fast, people are left behind. It's a fact. It's a fact of life. It's unfortunate. The question is, what are we going to do about it? That's what we have to figure out. And on that, I think we need to embrace a much greater sense of intentionality about getting focused about what we can do to make sure that as many people as possible are coming along, moving forward, that we're not leaving people behind, that we're making a genuine effort to engage people and know what matters to them, that we're making a genuine effort to ensure that our resources are allocated in ways that we don't either unintentionally or through omission or simply by mistake, we leave people out. That all requires that we're awake, that we're attuned, that we're present, that we're intentional. These are all really soft things, I know. But these are the things we need in order to do this work, because otherwise we make choices that keep moving forward and we just never look in the rearview mirror and see anyone. And that would be, I don't think that's the type of community that anyone here wants. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all the great work that you're doing, and I look forward to seeing you.